Okay, got my mushroom coffee. Hey, what's up, everyone? It's been a little bit. This is Alvin Teaches Poker. Today, I am going to be linking up with my student, Wesley Davis. He plays 50 and 100 no limit. And recently, he's been encountering a little bit of a break-even stretch. And so today, we are going into his database and exorcising some of the demons. Say hello, Wesley. How are you doing this evening?
I'm good, Alvin. How are you?
I'm good. I'm drinking my mushy coffee. All of the Rishi and Lion's Mane. Any kind of questions before we get started? Hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. Hopefully you have pen and paper and a notebook, but obviously this session is going to be recorded for posterity across the internets. Okay, cool.
I got it.
Okay, so we got your stats up. Let's see what jumps out at me. Okay, got my mushroom coffee. Hey, what's up, everyone? It's been a little bit. This is Alvin Teaches Poker. Today, I am going to be linking up with my student, Wesley Davis. He plays 50 and 100 no limit. And recently, he's been encountering a little bit of a break-even stretch. And so today, we are going into his database and exorcising some of the demons. Say hello, Wesley. How are you doing this evening?
I'm good, Alvin. How are you?
I'm good. I'm drinking my mushy coffee. All of the Rishi and Lion's Mane. Any kind of questions before we get started? Hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. Hopefully you have pen and paper and a notebook, but obviously this session is going to be recorded for posterity across the internets. Okay, cool.
I got it.
Okay, so we got your stats up. Let's see what jumps out at me. Okay, so one, you're doing a lot of things right. Okay, you're rarely cold calling. You're pretty aggressive pre-flop. It looks like in most of your raised first categories, you're doing a pretty good job sticking, to recommended ranges. I think very recently we've talked about at the small stakes games that ace jack. These offsuit broadways like ace 10, king jack, and queen jack offsuit, while often going to be mixes or raises in GTO Wizard, these hands are actually losing, mostly because at the smaller stakes we see so many of our opponents are flatting in position, and when we have our opponents flatting in position, that adds this kind of third contributing factor of rake. And so we're just paying rake all the time. And because rake is so exorbitantly expensive, especially at the small stakes, 100, 50, we can see that these hands are losing. So, hopefully we'll, from going forward, we'll be dropping a couple of these from our range. So we will be seeing your early position and middle position stats maybe drop, a point or two. Looking at the cutoff, just seeing, what are you generally profitable with. I am a little surprised to see that, suited 10x and ace jack offsuit, etc. are not profitable for you, but this might be a sample size issue. But, generally want to keep an eye on that and try to trim out some of the hand classes that are not going to be working for you, and then obviously try to improve your post flop to make, some of those more borderline raises automatically profitable. Your three betting in position, I will say, is probably a bit low. So we're going to be definitely looking for some spots where we probably want to ramp that up. In my eyes, the biggest spots where you are not being aggressive enough is from the small blind and from big blind versus small blind. So like here in the small blind, your three bet should probably be in the ballpark of 14 to 15%. Right? If we're just three betting a fairly linear range, it's always going to include facing a 2.5x, like sevens plus, some sixes, most of our suited 9x, right? And so, it seems like you're hitting most of these marks, so I'm kind of curious on why this number is so low, but this is over a decent sample size, right? So it's probably, a combination of your three betting in position being a little bit low, this number being low. Hard to now think that it's purely a sample issue, and more so that you're just not aggressive enough. Okay. Here, one of the biggest things from the big blind, this 3-betting percentage should probably be closer, especially at the rake structures you're playing, to like 15 or 16%. So, I do see that we are getting in some polarized 3-bets with, ace-6, ace-2, right? Like some of these like suited jacks or maybe some suited 10x type hands as well. But, it seems like we're probably just missing some frequencies with maybe like suited connectors, maybe a little bit of ace-jack or king-queen offsuit. But so just making sure that you are hitting all of these benchmarks, and it seems like, oh, it's only a 2% difference, it's a 3% difference, but like if you're getting in an extra 2 or 3 bets per session and taking those pots down, I mean, those are absolutely ginormous to your win rate. I often say that when I'm playing live, really my goal is to get in a 3-bet, c-bet the flop, and win the pot. If I can do that once per hour, I am like the biggest crusher in the universe, right? So making sure that we have all of those opportunities and that we are hitting all of these benchmarks is really, really important. Here, when I'm seeing, like small blind is only 3%. I mean, you might be missing a couple hands here. But really noticeably, here versus the button steal, our 3-bet should be in the ballpark of like, 10, 13%. It should be slightly less than the small blind. As a generality, our 3-betting from the big blind should be slightly less than it is, from the small blind across all positions. And so here, we're missing 3 to 4 points from the big blind, right? And so this could be maybe just, you're flatting these suited connectors more often instead of actually genuinely randomizing and 3-betting them pre-flop. Right, probably means that you're missing, a couple of the, the more polar hands, just in parts of your range, and it's going to be really important that either you have some kind of system for randomization, or you are using a randomizer yourself. So, very often what I recommend, for example, when I have 7-6 suited, is if it's 6-7 suited, I flat, and if it's 7-6 suited, I 3-bet. Right, so because I am using the mixing based on the left-right position of my cards, I never miss this mix. Right, because I just say, oh, all of the hands that I mix, except for like pocket pairs, I'm just going to be using the left-right mixing, right? And so making sure that you hit all these benchmarks is really critical. And, a lot of people don't realize if you don't get in all of these, small pips of aggression, your red line is going to consistently go down because you're just, not fighting hard enough. Okay. When I talk about not fighting hard enough, this also extends majorly to post flop. So your 1-win soft flop is 48. I'll tell you right now, as a generality, the 1-win soft flop of the population is 46. Okay? So whenever we VPIP, we're only winning 2% more pots than our opponents, right? In terms of your 1 money win soft flop rating, that is, how often you're expected to win divided by, the amount of times you win divided by the amount of players, right? You probably have a rating of above 1, right? That is, you win your pot share about as many times as you're expected. But really good players will have a 1 money win soft flop of like 52 to 54. Like I know back way in the day, legendary grinder Cole South had like a 54, 1 money win soft flop, really high, fought really, really hard for pots. And so we can see here, as a rule of thumb, you are 4% off of where you should be, right? There's a couple guys in the CFP who are at 52, me, Trey, Harris, and some of the, like the guys who, play like mid stakes or higher stakes have like 53 or 54 as well, right? So this is a huge goal for you to ramp up your 1-win soft flop and just fight harder, okay? And so we'll talk about some of those spots, obviously. But this is a whole kind of, perspective / philosophical approach, is that if you want to have a winning red line, you can't just shrug and give up as often as you do, right? We're going to also see there's going to be some post-flop spots where we just give up a little bit too easily. We fold like top pair good kicker facing a not very large double barrel, stuff like, right? Like hands that we should never fold and are getting into the territory where we're making kind of hero folds or hero calls. And this is something that I've espoused all the time. That is, if you are consistently crushing with your hero calls and hero folds, you would be playing high stakes, right? This is true of every single player I know, right? If you, when people are like, oh, should I play exploit, blah, 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 and they kind of ignore the GTO, principles and techniques behind really good poker, and they're just like, I'm just going to make all these good hero, these hero calls and hero folds. And then they never realize why they never move up is because they were making these kind of extreme plays, thinking that it is better than the norm when it is not, right? It's like when people pick stocks and they're like, oh, I'm going to crush compared to the S&P. Very, very rarely do people actually do that, right? It's very hard to beat, the herd knowledge in some senses. So you're making too many hero calls, too many hero folds, and then just, again, not grinding and just beating up on people nearly hard enough here. Let's see. 4-bet out of position looks good, right? This number should be in the low 20s, a little bit less, depending on what stake you're playing here. 4-bet in position actually looks a little bit low. This number, as a generality, should probably be closer to 11 or 12%, again, given your rake structure, and obviously this moves down to like 9 or 10 as you move up to like 500 no limit. But so I know I definitely would not mind having a couple of pips added to your 4-bet out of position and in position, particularly because, we know from exploitative frameworks that 4-betting is really, really good because our opponents are not like, 5-bet bluffing us. They're defending poorly in 4-bet pots in position and out of position post-flop. And so very often we'll find that despite some hands being good, hands to call 3-bets out of position, that they're actually better to, just go ahead and 4-bet and try to just take the pot down or reach to the flop with the betting lead. For example, we call 3-bets out of position. Here it seems like you're doing pretty well over very, very small sample with, various hand categories. But we'll see that over, I imagine, the larger sample and a sample of many of my students, calling 3-bets out of position is generally just not very profitable. And you're just getting put into really, really difficult spots that are hard to counter until you have kind of gained a decent amount of theoretical knowledge so you can fight back in that spot. For example, knowing when you should check raise bottom pair when you defend a suited connector, right? So like when you have like 5-6 suited and you defend and the flop comes like ace high and there's a 6 or a 5, more likely to check raise than if it comes a jack high with a 6 or a 5 because, our hand has much more showdown value and the board is not ace high, stuff like that. Went to showdown looks pretty good. Maybe actually should be a little bit lower. Like having a pretty high went to showdown and won at showdown is probably indicative that, again, we're not fighting hard enough for pots and we're just kind of trying to check down medium hands. We're not turning enough weak hands into bluffs, right? In my opinion, at the smaller stakes, because our opponents are generally a little bit more predictable, we actually don't have to go to showdown that often, right? Like if our opponents are predictable and say they have weak hands, then, we bluff them a lot with our slightly weaker hands. And, if our opponents have, stronger hands, we should be able to get out of the way fairly reliably because our opponents are going to be more predictable than we are. So I think that, these stats are, in of themselves not problematic, but when combined with the one money win soft flop being as low as it is, right? I think that is really the difference. And just think about it like this, if you just win 4% more pots, right, as a whole, right, that is a gigantic change in your win rate, right? If you win 4 more pots per 100 hands or 100 flops you see, right, that is a gigantic amount of money added. In terms of your stealing, you're doing it the opposite way. That is, when people are using the large size, you're 3-betting less, and when people are using the small size, you're 3-betting more. And this should be the opposite, okay? When people use the large size, there's more dead money, right? We are now more incentivized to 3-bet pre-flop and take the blinds down, and we really don't want to ever call a 5x open from the big blind and then check fold the flop, right? That is the absolute death of our red line, right? The bigger our opponent raises, the more we want to 3-bet. So much so that when we're facing even a 3.5 or 4x at this rake structure, we're probably already only getting into 3-bet or fold territory. Meanwhile, when we're facing the button 2.0, 1, we should generally be folding only 40% of the time, so we're probably missing a couple defenses. I will say against the button steal, we should be, only folding 40%. I'm sorry, we should be calling 60% or continuing 60% of the time. I'm sorry, I'm saying this completely wrong. Here we should be folding 40% against the 2x. We should be folding 60% against the button. So we see that we're over folding against both sizings, over 3-betting here. I would much prefer to see your 3-bet from the button be closer to 15 and your 3-bet against the 2.0 be closer to 10. Okay, so these, I think you're doing the, oh, he raised small, so he must have a weak hand, or I can win more often kind of line of thinking, and I'm not sure if this is actually true. When we 3-bet here against the 2x, they fold 50% of the time, and here when we actually, they do fold less when they 2x it here, right? So you can see, raising them more is not really getting the job done more efficiently. Their 2x is not a tell that they're going to continue less often. Okay. Single raised pots in position. I know there's a bajillion stats there for those of you guys who are looking at home, and I apologize if the stats are a little bit small. I'll try to blow them up as I'm kind of talking about them, so they'll be a little bit easier to see. So the first thing I'm going to notice is that your barrels in position are 83, 40, 60. Okay, this is in the ballpark of where we want to be, in that we are exploiting our opponents on the flop by just betting a ton, right? We know that very often when we down bet flops, people are going to have a lot of difficulty defending correctly. But what I am thinking is going on is that we are playing too polarized on the turn, right? So if our c-bet is now falling to 40%, and it should be in the 40s or like mid 40s, we're probably playing too polar here and not looking for enough opportunities for us to go for thin barrels, particularly on somewhat draw heavy boards where we have, more like second pair top kicker type hands, some medium pair type hands, so like jacks on queen 9x, or when we're playing against recreational players and they've just kind of turned their hand face up on an early street, right? So, if we bet small on the flop, villain super snap calls, there should now be a lot of turns that we just close our eyes and begin to bluff, right? So sometimes this could be an attention thing. We're not being attentive enough to the speed and timing of which our opponents are calling and then not finding enough barrels. It could be autopiloting too much and not looking, okay, this opponent is 54-12. Maybe we don't have to be polar to top pair on the turn and we can go for thinner value with some of our medium pair type hands. And here, right, as predicted, we can see from this, this distribution here, there's no draw and pair, no low pair, and no middle pair, right? And so middle pair should also include hands like I c-bet ace jack on a jack high flop turn king. Right? Like that's a spot where middle pair often actually goes for 3 streets of value. So there's going to be just too many times where you have flop top pair and the turn is a somewhat scary card. And you now play extremely passively, check back, and often let your opponent kind of dictate the size of the pot, right? Going forward, right? This also probably leaves your opponent open to either realizing a little bit too much equity or hitting a scare card on the river that is now scary to your second pair type hand and now lets him fire. So for example, if the board was jack high, turn ace, you check back and the river's a king, now your opponent's going to often be able to get you to bluff off your hand. So yeah, so indeed we saw that 40% shows you that we are not nearly as as merged enough and we're a little bit too polar. Here in terms of like what boards are we continuing to fire? I mean, like, again, really small sample size, but it looks like the only time we fired on like a 10 high flop, or like a low flop, low turn, which is, as I've said many times, one of the absolute, worst spots to bluff. We only did it with flushes and straights. So there must be some spots where we have like, top pair weak kicker that we can just go bet in position in those kind of spots. Here looking at like, how are we proceeding on an ace high flop? it looks like on the turn we are quite polar to like, gut shots, draws, but there should be some theoretical trash in some of these ranges, right? So like I see as a whole we don't have enough like random hands that would be considered trash. So maybe some of this gets classified into 1-over, such as like a suited king 2, king 3 hands that block top pair, top kicker, unblock our opponent's call fold range. But I do think that there should still be some hands that we would probably categorize as future blockers that would fall into trash. Right, so there has to be some. So we're not firing future blockers enough, or these kind of more exotic hand categories. Something I talk about in Overnight Monster is also having the nut call fold, the nut unblocker, which allows our opponent to call fold. So just off the dome, and this is actually probably going to be right on Jack 8-2. That with hearts, spades, and diamonds, 4-5 of clubs with some frequency will find a triple barrel because it maximizes our opponent's call fold. And so we probably are missing some of those, more exotic hand categories. Not saying that those are extremely important to have, but what's really important is we can pretty much see that whenever we bet the turn with all of our hand classes, it's been profitable, right? So like, arguably in a vacuum, if we just close our eyes and bet the turn, everything is profitable across every board. Even here, when I, look at random, different textures, we can see almost everything we bet has been profitable, right? We see on a paired turn or, 8-2 disconnected, or I don't even know where I was looking. Where was I looking here? Well, anyways, I saw one of these just had, so like a 3 flush. Everything you bet on a 3 flush has been profitable. 1-over card has been profitable. Right, so just finding a bunch of more of these hands that probably are good candidates from a theory perspective to go, to unblock our opponent's call folds or block his calling range needs to be in our hand. So that this also could be stuff like on a Queen 9 board, we have King of Spades, 8 of Hearts or something like that, right? So that's going to be a spot where we have, again, that might actually fall into 1-over from, instead of trash. But you get the idea of what kind of hand classes we probably should be looking for. Because you are firing so rarely on the turn, I imagine that this should naturally inflate your triple barrel, simply because you're going to probably not have enough bluffs here to follow through with. So this might be a spot where, this is probably not bad, right? Here around the pot size, we're over bluffing. Here at the large sizing, we've been over bluffing over, whatever sample size. I'm not going to really judge here. But probably need to find some more natural give ups here in the large sizing from balance perspectives. If people don't know what you're doing, then it doesn't really matter. Really critical idea, right? If people aren't countering you, it doesn't really matter what you do if it's winning. But if we see that also we're getting to this river node printing with a lot of our bluffs and value bets getting, 70% folds when we, really hammer them, that probably just means there's way more hand classes that should follow through from the turn and the river, because these are now just going to be really profitable barrels, right? We've talked about how whenever we know that our opponent is making a giant leak in one particular node of the game tree, a lot of our pre-flop and post-flop tendencies now contort themselves so that we reach that part of the game tree as often as possible, right? Looking at your flop bets, okay. So here, I think that we need to be incorporating more checks on the flop, right? So off the bat, I'm noticing, for example, your, again, sample size issues, but on an 8-2 disconnected flop, and these are not usually very good flops for us to simplify, right? Like these are flops where usually you want to play half better check, where there's probably just too many times where we're just like betting small here, right? Because like on, 2-7-5, a small bet is actually not too punished from a simplification perspective in this. You know, there were actually a bunch of boards where like I thought that we were not really allowed to simplify, and I was actually shocked that we were allowed to. Like 825 is probably a board where we are allowed to simplify, but just from an efficiency perspective, this doesn't really give your opponents any difficulties, right? So especially when you're moving up to 100, like it's probably time to embrace adding some of those spots where we have more checkbacks on the flop, right? Because we definitely know that whenever we check back and our opponent leads out into us, that's going to be a spot where they're probably going to be over bluffing, particularly on a bunch of different board textures. And so, if you're just like playing a bunch of guys and never realizing, oh wow, these guys are probably not very good and too, messy with their bets. They're not very functional with their bets. They'll turn too many hands into bluffs on accidents. They'll value cut themselves. They'll, bet hands that block your folding range, yada, yada, yada. There's so much money to be made by checking back. Right, so I think you are currently limiting yourself with your oversimplification on the flop, which then leads, you're oversimplifying on the flop and then not following through nearly enough on the turn, right? And so, like, I think then it would make a lot of sense that we probably start, mixing in way more checks on these kind of like lower disconnected flops, and and again, looking actively for our weaker opponents and looking for the edges that we want to exploit them, right? So very often when I see people have a strategy that doesn't seem to be very flexible, right? Like when I see someone c-bet on these boards being, really, really high, they're probably just a little bit too rigid. It probably indicates that you're not being observant enough and taking times to look at your opponents in hands that you're not participating in to look for their weaknesses. Because like very often, if I'm just paying attention to a random recreational player, I'll notice, oh wow, facing check back, they play horribly. Right? Because like a lot of the times on a lot of boards where they should be like checking near range to you, over betting or checking the turn, right? Not stabbing a lot. This is the exact opposite of what our opponents do in reality. We're not taking advantage of that at all. Okay? So I really, really emphasize on particularly these like, 8 or 9 high boards, right? And below, you are only going to be playing a mixed strategy on the flop and adding that kind of dimension to your game. Because like, there's going to also be a ceiling to the simplification where one, you move up to rake structures where, villains are going to be defending a lot more hands, and simplification is probably just not going to be as efficient at some spots. And two, like again, you're limiting your ability to ever grow from a exploitative perspective because you're not giving your opportunities to punish your opponents for their exploits. Okay, so I would also probably say that, again, I'm probably making, some messy assumptions here, but when someone has, a 93% betting on a, 10 to 9 disconnected flop, again, this probably is indicating you're not taking enough notes, right? You're autopiloting too much. And so I really, really hope that going forward, particularly when you like present hand histories, your hand histories go beyond just a note saying, oh, he's 22-7, right? It's like the HUD stats. And you have more notes saying, oh wow, he checked back with on the flop with X or Y hand and then folded to, or called down with X or Y hand, right? Oh, facing checkbacks, he stabs in ways that we can tell he's a fish, right? Like very often, and this goes for all of my students, right? When you present hands and you consistently are presenting hands that are, when you're like sitting with an opponent for 50 or 60 hands and you say, I have no notes besides my HUD stats, that's a huge mistake. Right? Like, I don't think a lot of people ought to realize that if you're playing against a guy, hundreds, thousands of hands, and you're like, I have no notes besides the HUDs, then you have failed as a poker player, right? Like, you are completely ignoring an entire, half of the game by sticking to the kind of rigidity here. So hopefully we can find this kind of, philosophical difference, right, in your game where we are going to be able to, have more reads and be able to, attack our opponents, with a lot more guaranteed information from showdowns. I will say here, this is just, I'm giving out tons of sauce here. Your barrels versus limp, really, really low. There is that video where I'm playing like 2 tables of 50 in a limit zone, and I'm sure all of you guys who are listening to this call walked away with that timing tell where, particularly against limpers, I snap bet the flop, they snap call, and then I close my eyes, just smash turn. Doesn't matter what my hand is, and it is insanely profitable, right? I'm sure that I know a couple of you guys have been working with that, and it's been really, really good. Fish just cannot, get rid of this tell, particularly if they're playing zone, right? They just mash fold, or just mash like instantaneous hands because they just want that rush. And so here we're missing just way too many double barrels, right? I'm sure that your bet check bet is working amazingly as bluff, right? Here over this sample, you're getting 70% folds, but when we double barreled, you're getting 63% folds too, right? So that probably just means there's just too many hands that are like 1 overcard, 2 overcards, a gut shot, right? Just, some kind of just like medium hand classes that just have like decent blockers. Sometimes going for it with 4 high because you think villain just snap called on the flop, right? You need to give yourself this kind of exploitative room and make sure that you are paying attention to your opponents instead of autopiloting, right? I smell a lot of autopiloting in this, right? I mean, generally I smell autopiloting when someone comes to me with a graph like this, right? Like the first thing I'm thinking is, oh, you're not paying enough attention, right? Because like, if we were paying a lot of attention to our opponents, we would know, oh, well then, a bunch of times he used this sizing, so I knew he had nothing, so I ran a bluff on him. Or, oh, he used this sizing with a really strong hand and this hand with a really weak hand, so now I don't need to find a fold to him, etc., right? When we know all of our opponent's tendencies really well, we don't fold to them anymore, right? We run them over. So having this general game plan of figuring out what are my opponent's weaknesses and going after those specific weaknesses needs to be built into your game more, right? Once you have that part of your game kind of built up, then you're going to find that, everything else is going to, really fall into place very quickly. Once you, it's an attitude adjustment, right? If the attitude is, I'm going to kind of just, robotically go for these default bluffs that I know are solid, right? You're going for a bunch of bluffs that we know from like mass data situations, are very, very profitable, right? But like, you're probably still missing a bunch of other spots that are really, really profitable or even more profitable because of this rigidity. So, we delay, we double delay, right? These numbers are good. Again, sample size issues. Seems like as a generality, after checkbacks on earlier streets, we're coming after them pretty hard. I will say, here, this is a spot, you're getting a ton of folds when you overbet. That's great. Your bet check fold on the river is quite high, okay? I don't know why this number is so high if our turn c-bet is so polar, right? Because if our turn c-bet is so polar, this speaks to me that we have a lot of medium strength hands on the river. We should have a bunch of like mid pair, low pair, top pair, weak kicker type hands. So then why are we folding 60% of the time on the river? Right? Probably means that we're just folding too many hands here. Or it could be that too often we're not turning our low players into bluffs. Right? So it probably is, like, I'm just going to pick a random hand here. We can see we have pocket 4s or king 8 here. Right? We see bet the flop, the turn checks, villain bets. Yeah, I mean, this might not be the best spot to like go for it. Right? But like, here's a spot with 9s where, depending on the opponent, might be a spot where we probably should bet the turn if the villain is bad. And again, I'm assuming at 25 no limit, a lot of these opponents are bad, right? Like here, this is going to be a spot where we reach the river with third pair, but like raising this river is probably going to be really, really good here. Our hand is, close, very, very close to the top, the top of our folding range, bottom of our calling range. And, I mean, you've heard me say it a million times, right? When you are very sketchy about a hand, but it's close, usually a pretty good indicator, that it should be a bluff, right? Because now it is, top of your folding range. And usually it also means that you have good blockers to like 2 pairs and stuff like that. So definitely need to be looking for some spots where we can go for bet check raise. Also, hard to know, like, against what bet, what bet sizing you are raising what hands. But when we get to the river and villain block bets, we should often be raising like top pair, like no kicker, right? So there's probably going to be some spots where we have like top pair or like a decent hand in villain blocks, and we're not looking for enough thin value raises there. I mean, that's not a huge amount of EV to anyone's game, so I don't want you to like really bemoan this. But I do get the sense that we're folding too often here, or just not battling, right? So definitely need to be battling here. Anytime our bet check fold is this high, anytime it's over 50%, you are folding here way too often. Okay. Also, I would say, in theory, bet check bet in position should be close to like 40%. In practice, it should be higher because people overfold, right? But this number probably is even on the low end, considering some of the other exploits you're going. I mean, like I can see in some of the other spots you're going for, pretty extreme aggressive exploits. I agree with a lot of them. I probably think that you're choosing to give it up in some spots, right? There's probably just a bunch of hand classes here where you just like have hands that should just go for it and give up. Maybe like we double barrel low pair, give up river. Right, like here, I mean, maybe this 4x probably gives up here, right? Like here, 8s, I don't understand why this is a double barrel and then give up the river. Like, this hand does not seem to make sense to me as a double barrel, but also as a hand that does make sense. Oh, I mean, I guess a 9 comes on the river. I mean, maybe even better reason to keep betting. But yeah, so I mean, like, can't tell from the sample, but, indicative of things that we need to look out for. Okay, so this is the giant leak here. Again, sample size issues, but I can again tell from your graph that this has to be the case. You're folding your life away on every street, right? When we fold the flop here, if villains, you are overfolding extremely dramatically facing every size. Here facing a quarter bet on the flop, you folded 45% of the time. This number should be, right, much closer to 25 or 20. Depending on some boards, right? Like there's some spots in, we know in 3-bet pots in some spots, like on the flop, when people bet a quarter or this, our folding range should be like 8 or 9%, right? Like I'm pretty sure I've, over lessons we've talked about, there's some boards where we should virtually have no folding range, right? Like if villain like down bets on like an 8 high flop, we just don't ever fold to them, right? So here, overfolding facing all sizes, single raise pots, overfolding facing all sizes, and especially on the turn. So anytime a guy's fold approaches 50%, usually a spot where we want to attack them a lot. So on the flop, you are just folding way too much. On the turn, folding way, way, way too much. Here, when we go into call down mode, have been basically losing, except when we have like the nutter ball. Right, so again, sample size issues, but need to be thoughtful over your entire sample if we are making some, like too many, like we fold too much on the turn and then always get stubborn on the river. Might be going on, right? That is something that I encounter occasionally with students. But you are folding way too much. So, yeah, because here. Oh, okay. It's like, is it low pot? I mean, here there's some hands where we fold middle pair on the flop. Right here, facing a very small bet, sometimes we're folding like low pockets. I mean, imagine they have to all be like complete under pairs to the board. But some of these spots probably are still going to be calls because your opponent's just range betting really small. Right, again, hard to tell, but as a general trend, you see these numbers are insanely out of line. Okay, so I would do a lot of drilling in GTO Wizard. I would spend a lot of time looking at big blind defense, and I'd also go over the big blind defense masterclass in a lot more depth. You're probably just missing way too many hands that are like double backdoors, right? Like, I like to think as a vague guideline, when my opponent bets small, I always continue with almost all of my like double backdoors, right? Like never folding a gut shot on the flop, basically. Because a clean gut shot usually has 20% equity, right? So really don't want to fold that facing like 75 on the flop. And also when our opponents bet half pot, we should always continue if we have like 2 live cards with one back or 2 back doors, right? So you probably are also missing some hands that are like 2 live cards to middle pair, right? And you might be like only calling when you have like 2 live cards to top pair instead, right? But no matter what's going on, we need to be, loosening up this, these calling down ranges. And we can speak to this, obviously more in depth going over, hand by hand sessions. We're kind of just doing a general overview of what your leaks are right now. In 3-bet pots, I'm going to tell you right now, you're not barreling enough. Okay, this is both on the turn and on the river. These stats, in my opinion, should be something like, 70, mid-50s as well. Right here, we're giving up way more in 3-bet pots out of position, which is fine. But I imagine there's going to be some spots where we are firing with hands that are not really good candidates here. So here in these triples, I'm not seeing things like missed straight draw, missed gut shot, or missed overcards, like lower overcards, like queen jack on a 10 high board or something like that. And so it seems like we're only showing up with ace king, ace queen, ace jack as our bluffs here. And like the problem with this is like these kind of hands, when they triple off, are very often the hand classes that are blocking a lot of our opponent's folding range or are not relevant blockers to top pair at this point. So for example, on a queen high flop, when we have ace king or something like that, right? Not always the best triple, mostly because our opponent might 4-bet ace queen in some spots pre-flop. They might fold it pre-flop. They might check raise flop and like put the money in on earlier streets. So it's very unreliable for our ace X to be, one of the hands that we want to be barreling through, right? So this is often a mistake that people misunderstand, is that they think, oh, ace king on a queen high board, it should be an automatic barrel for all of the streets, but that is not necessarily the case. It usually should be tempered by estimating what frequency of ace queen your opponent actually arrives at the river. So like against these more passive guys, maybe that's going to be a little bit better, but then you eventually get into this argument where your opponents are so passive and so loose that why are we running triple barrel bluffs in position on them for our stack, right? But so yeah, not enough double barreling on the turn. Looks like here on the turn, there's just not enough 2 overcards, right? There's not enough gut shots. There's not enough straights. We're too polar to like good hands and really strong draws, and we're just missing just a bunch of like 4 out type hands, right? Keep in mind, if we're betting 50%, 60% on the turn, our opponent should be defending, 33 to 38% of the time, something like that, right? They're folding 40%. So if you literally closed your eyes and bet any 2 on the flop and on the turn, there's going to be some spots where that will be profitable and you're missing a bunch of those. Right? And because you're missing too many hand classes on the turn, that means we're naturally missing too many hand classes when we triple barrel in position and triple barrel out of position. And I will say, just from a macro perspective, it's really doing it backwards. When in position, we barrel off less, and then out of position, we barrel off more. Right? This is completely backwards. It should be the opposite, right? In position, we put on a lot more aggression. Our opponents are going to be more capped. While out of position, our opponent's going to have more traps, etc., right? Like, we should be giving up more, right? So there needs to be an inversion of these frequencies here. 4-bet pots, seems like you're pretty aggressive here, right? Like, again, sample size infinitesimally small, so we can't really make, too many reads here. I will just say 92 might be a little bit high. There should be occasionally some boards that we check, right? Particularly the boards that we want to consider having a checking range. It's going to be like queen XX, where the X's are sets that villain can have. So example, like queen 9-8, queen 8-7, queen 6-7 are often going to be a little bit shakier, right? We can start developing a check range. And stuff like, jack 8-7, these 3 middling cards are usually going to be very, very good for villain. And in position, we just kind of close our eyes and just barrel through, though, there are some spots where this becomes a little bit more inaccurate. Like, for example, in the same spot, we 4-bet in position, the flop comes queen 6-7. This is probably not going to be a spot where we should have a pure c-bet on the flop. I think this is actually a spot where villains should be donking some percentage of the time. And because villains never actually find that donk and they check range to us, our exploit should be checking back a lot of hands as well. But a a little bit technical and not going to be too worrisome when we're playing against opponents whose pre-flop ranges are going to be a little bit too messy anyway. It's not going to have, the GTO recommended pre-flop hands to allow him to have the donks and board coverage to do these kind of fancy things. Okay, but so overall prescription, right, is more. I almost said cowbell. It is more fighting very hard for every single pot. Okay, you are folding too much to bets. You're not barreling enough. You're not 3-betting enough, and you are doing the opposite in some spots where you're attacking the less money in the pot when we're not incentivized to steal, and right when we are incentivized to steal more, right when we're incentivized to re-steal more, right, we do it less. This also is just going into the next kind of student growth that you can have is that I know 100% we have already talked about this statistic. Now, this might be just because we're looking at the last 4 months and we haven't had enough time to change this, right? But I'm not sure these have changed, and I know that we've been talking about this for a decent amount of time. It really behooves you to go through all of your notes and make sure that you are following all of the directions, because, right, we can tell that some stuff is falling through the cracks. Okay, this is also leads to stuff like not checking in enough, not asking enough questions, not making sure the hands get in every week, right? These kind of stuff all seem small, right? And you're just like, oh, I'm just gonna coast and be a little bit lax on these 1 or 2 things. But when we are on this road to mastery, all of these spots where you're saying, I'm gonna have slightly less discipline, really substantially add up over the course of your career, and often changes, in my mind, changes the trajectory from players who are going to be like really crushing players to guys who maybe never make it out of 200. Okay, so we completely agree on some of these things. Was I right when I said you probably are not taking enough notes and not really honing in and beating your exact opponent in front of you?
Yes, I understand. Yeah, you're right completely.
Okay, good. And that's also something that obviously you can't do that while you're playing zone, but I know you're playing reg tables, right? If you're playing regular tables, at the end of every session, every opponent should have 4 or 5 notes on them on every table. Okay, so that's also why I'm sure, and I'm sure that people listening in who have made it this far into the podcast will say, wow, that's not me, right? When you watch Phil Ivey on TV, is there any hand where Phil Ivey looks bored and checked out, right? You always see that even when he's not in a hand, his eyes are just like flitting around the table. He's always gathering information. He's always locked in, right? Like, there is also, right, this kind of entitlement tilt where you're like, oh, I'm getting coaching. I have I have studied better technical baseline expertise, right? But if you're not actually applying that and executing it at a high level, it's as if you've never studied it at all. Okay, so this has been Alvin Teaches Poker. Hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive into some of Wesley's leaks. Wesley seems to be a pretty good candidate to bring back in a couple months. So can we do that? Right? You're gonna take all these leaks to heart. We're gonna come back in like 8 weeks and see how you're doing. Sound good, Wesley?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Okay, cool. So this is Alvin Teaches Poker. Good luck, guys.